Hello. If you're here to know what my dead zones and sensitivities are, you should join my Discord server, and there I have a bunch of different settings for each controller and what I've used and all my updated settings. But today we're gonna actually learn a couple of things. I'm gonna give you a small guide on how to find dead zones and sensitivities step by step. I'm gonna show you how to properly use 10 aerial sense and why you might want to switch to 10 aerial sense. And finally, I'm gonna show you some settings you can change on sim configuration or DS4 windows that might help you switch more easily from cross dead zone to square dead zone, or maybe just to get a specific stick feel that you can't get through Rocket League only. If you need to learn more about square dead zone and why it's useful for your car control, check out my square dead zone tutorial where I teach you how to get it and why to get it. Anyways, let's start with the video. So there's a couple of things I want to talk about before we actually get into the guide and everything. So first of all, what are good controller settings? Good controller settings are settings that won't restrain your ability to learn new things in the future. That's about it. So for that matter, square dead zone is what I believe to be the right choice. You'll get way more control. If you want to learn why, of course, there's my tutorial. And many people say that when you switch to square dead zone, you lose your ability to spit flip consistently, or you lose all control as it starts to feel faster and less controlled. But really, the only reason why you wouldn't want to switch to square dead zone is if you don't feel comfortable using a third-party software and you feel like it may lead to input lag or just overall inconsistencies, or you just don't want to get rid of all the muscle memory you have with cross dead zone. Either way, I think it's the best switch. I think it won't stop you from improving if you do go ahead and switch. Now, the second thing I wanted to talk about is a small disclaimer before we start the video, and that is that every single controller has a different feel. If you play with a PS4 controller, if you play with a Thrustmaster, if you play with an Xbox, each controller will have its own feel around the center of the sticks, and it will just feel different. And every dead zone and sensitivity configuration software has also its own feel. So if I'm using sim configuration and you're not, even if it's both cross dead zone, you will still feel a difference between both of them. The third thing is you won't have the same feel as I do if you only copy the RL settings. I'm talking about stall and flip consistency, precision. So yeah, that's basically it. So if you do want to get the exact same feel as I do, you're gonna have to change to every single setting that I use. So let's start. So how should you find dead zones and sensitivities? Well, how I do it is a little bit simpler. I take a more step-by-step approach. This could take around a day or 2 or 3 to find them. Right now, of course, I'm showing you the steps, but each step could take maybe around an hour to find perfectly. At least for me. You can maybe find it in 10 minutes, but I don't recommend that because you're gonna turn out with a lot of placebo, so you wanna take this slowly. So the first thing I recommend is you should definitely choose a controller and a controller configuration that you're going to stick to. Don't constantly change between controller configurations and controllers, because then you're going to get into a lot of placebo, and you don't want placebo. Speaking from experience, you want to avoid placebo at all costs. So you want to take this slowly and make sure that the process is slow and steady for your brain to capture properly. Now, the first setting that we're going to change is the controller dead zone. So now first we need to understand what the controller dead zone does. So there's a couple of things that you need to understand about the controller dead zone. First of all, it manages the area in which you can do a perfect side input, back input, front input. So as you increase your controller dead zone, this little area to do perfect inputs to the sides or up and down, it will increase. And then if you decrease that, then you're going to notice that there's no such thing as a perfect side flip, perfect front flip, or perfect back flip. So the more you increase it, the more consistent those inputs are going to be. And so that works for cancels and for stalls, and also to make sure that you also get those side inputs properly. So if you're moving like a helicopter, you want to make sure that you're moving completely flat, or you want to make sure that you're moving completely straight. And so to do that, you just increase it a bit. And the more you do that, the flatter and the more consistent it will get. What you want to do with this controller dead zone is you want to actually decrease it to the point where these things, so stalls, flip cancels, flips, movement, starts to feel just consistent enough. It's not yet consistent, but it's just consistent enough. And you don't have to worry about the failing around the center. We're gonna worry about that later. So now that that feels just consistent enough, we're gonna give ourselves a little bit of a caution to make sure that we're getting those things consistently. Just making sure that everything's consistent. So say you decrease it to 0.25 or 0.5. Now you're gonna increase your controller dead zone by a little bit. So the lower you go, the less you're gonna increase it. But say you're in 0.5, you're gonna maybe increase it 2. And 0.15, maybe you're gonna increase it by like 4, 3, 5 maybe. If you're at like 0.30, you're gonna maybe wanna increase it by like 5, 4, something like that. And then once you've increased it by that amount, you're gonna start to feel like those kinds of things are more and more consistent. Right now, beware, we're not talking about movement and feel in the air. So don't try and go for aerials, don't try and do all that stuff. Just try and make sure that this thing specifically, the direction of the movement, your flips, your stalls are consistent. So now, this is what a lot of people ask me. And why do pro players use a low controller dead zone? The reason why is they don't care about stalls. They don't care about front flip cancels. They are already good enough using diagonal flip cancels. So they don't need these things. They don't mind having a way lower controller dead zone. Us freestylers actually do need a higher controller dead zone to make sure that our flips are consistent. It doesn't mean that every freestyler will have a low controller dead zone or a high controller dead zone. It only means that we're looking for that consistency. So you may be very, very consistent with flip cancels with a low controller dead zone, but that's you. Maybe you're just insanely good at the game. But a lot of freestylers are not as good, so they have to get rid of those inconsistencies with flips. And so we increase our controller dead zone. So that's about it. If you're kind of a competitive player that doesn't care about stalls or flip cancels or just movement that's completely straight, then you're gonna have to decrease it as much as possible. So that would be what most pro players have, which would be around 0.07. And if you do care about all those things, then you're gonna increase it more and more till you feel like you are consistent with those things. But I never recommend going too high. If you're already consistent at it, then just go as low as possible. So now that you have a comfortable controller dead zone, now we're gonna actually bring back the natural feel of a low dead zone. And to do that, I recommend that as you increase your controller dead zone, you also increase gradually your aerial sensitivity. So this is the magic trick. This is actually the magic trick when it comes to choosing your sends. Because as you increase this, you'll start to get rid of that slowiness around the center of the sticks. So you're gonna have to increase it gradually and at a constant ratio. And to help you with that, I actually have a little table that I use to find this aerial sensitivity to get that natural feel back. So for example, right now, if I use 0.30 controller dead zone, I would go ahead and search for something in my aerial sense in between 3 and 5. And so I would maybe go for a bit of a higher aerial sense. And the way you test this is usually with things like ergibles. So when you're doing an ergible, you'll just have to try and notice how consistent the movement feels. So if you're not overshooting, if you're overshooting, if you're undershooting, of course, and that's what you'll try and feel. So for example, this feels a little bit quicker than normal. So I'm overshooting a tiny bit as I'm moving. I just feel like it's a little bit too fast. And so I'll decrease it a little bit. So let's say this. And I'll just try and figure out an aerial sense. And we're not worrying about the steering sensitivity right now. That's something we'll deal with later. But you'll just have to try and find a good sense here. And you don't want to spin when you're doing air dribbles, because the spinning air dribbles don't require as many tiny inputs that are precise. It just requires straight inputs in different directions with good timing. So you want to actually do normal air dribbles for this, or normal aerials for the same matter. And you just want to get to a point where you feel like you're comfortable enough with how your car moves around in the air. You feel comfortable with the speed at which it moves, so that you can stop your car in the right moment and such. So that's about it for aerial sensitivity. Now the last step, and it's the thing that most people start to care about when they move to these kinds of settings, is your steering sense. And unfortunately, I can't do much about this. There's a couple of things I can help you with if you skip to the fine-tuning processes with DS4 and Steam controller configuration. I'll teach you how to get rid of that, but I don't recommend it. So here, as with every single KVM player, you're gonna just have to deal with less of a variable input around the center of the sticks. You're just gonna have to go ahead and rely a bit more on timing and making sure that you're putting your car and moving your car. It's really not that big of a difference. Like, maybe you're losing a bit of movement around the center, but it's not enough to justify not having all these other advantages of a low controller dead zone. So you just want to deal with it. And if KVM players can do it, so can you. So just move to a higher steering sensitivity and higher controller dead zone. And I think you can do it. And then the last thing you may want to ask this is dodge dead zone. Dodge dead zone doesn't affect anything. It has nothing to do with the process of choosing. If you're double jumping a lot, you're just gonna have to decrease it. If you're backflipping a lot in your aerial shots, then you're just gonna have to increase it. That's it. So that's the way I choose my controller dead zones and controller sensitivities. And it usually works out for me. And you just want to make sure that everything about your controller dead zones is just well balanced. That's about it. There's not much I can do for you in terms of aerial control. I can teach you a bit of things, but that aerial control doesn't come from having a perfect controller. It comes from you practicing good muscle memory. So now for those players that want to switch to 10 aerial sense, you hear all this talk about freestylers switching to 10 aerial sense. First of all, why would you do that? The reason why you would do that is a couple. So first of all, the feel. You might like the feel a little bit more. That's the first thing. So you might want to try it. The second thing is you might want to just get better inputs on your cancel to spin faster as you're canceling. So sometimes people just cancel and move their sticks very little. And if you move your stick very little, you can still manage to do a full input to that side. So in that case, you're actually getting an input that's fast and consistently at the right speed. And the third thing, and why you would want to switch, is maybe you want faster cancels. Now, I don't think that's really true. I think at around 2 aerial sense, you start to notice a bit of a faster cancel. But after that, you don't really notice a big difference between 2 and 10. You just notice that your car moves more rapidly if your muscle memory is keen to doing that. But I don't think it gives you a faster cancel. It just kind of feels like it. So how do you switch to 10 aerial sense? So with 10 aerial sense, you'll have to basically keep in mind that around the center of the sticks, there's no such thing as a slight movement in that direction. So if you want to move your stick very little, you won't be able to do it. Now what you will have to rely on is you'll have to rely on fast inputs to be precise. Instead of moving your stick very little, you'll have to actually start moving your stick fast and quickly and very hard in some directions. So it's a bit of a different mentality you need to get. That's it though. If you feel like you're the type of person that moves your stick a lot, so I see a lot of COD players doing that, like you move your stick a lot, then 10 cents might be the setting for you. And it doesn't mean you can't be precise, it just means that it changes the way you control your car in the air. So the difference between a 10 aerial sense erigible and a low aerial sense erigible is that with 10 aerial sense, the movements are a bit tinier, faster, and just more precise in timing, but not in movement. But I can still be as precise with 10 aerial sense. So it's not a bad switch. It just means there's a different feel to it. So you're gonna fine tune with third-party software for two reasons really. So the first one is whenever you're switching from cross dead zone to square dead zone, what happens is you start to feel a bit wobbly, and that's what a lot of you guys probably felt when you switch to square dead zone. You start to feel like you're not in complete control. And so I'm gonna give you some settings to actually help with that. And the second thing, when you switch to square dead zone, what you usually try and do is try and increase your controller dead zone to get more consistent flips, but you also get rid of the center stick precision. So we're gonna try and manage both of those things separately. One thing I'm gonna say is I do not recommend doing this. I do recommend it as a transitionary thing, so it's a temporal thing, so you're gonna use it for a bit and then you're gonna try and switch to the default option. You're gonna try to move out of this and then fully switch to square dead zone. So on Steam, as you know, you go to manage control layout and here. In here, there's a couple of settings and it could be overwhelming, but there's really very few settings you can change. And each setting works for different purposes. But as I said, I'm gonna basically take a look at the most important ones for each purpose. So the first one, and the one that's gonna help you go from cross dead zone to square dead zone, is the stick response curve. So this one here, what it actually does is the inputs around the center of the stick start to become a little bit more precise, and then as you get closer and closer to the diagonals, it starts to go faster. And so what this does, it's kind of countering what it happens when you have way faster diagonals. So as your car starts feeling way too fast to control, you just have to make it a little bit more slow and controlled without giving up the speed in the outer parts of your stick. So this is what this one does, and the one I recommend to use is a relax curve, but not really a relax curve because that could feel too slow. What I recommend actually is using a custom curve, and with a custom curve you go a little bit low. Usually with this I recommend going just relaxed enough and then just try and see if it fits. What you're going to do with this, as I said, is you're going to transition into square dead zone, so you don't have to stick to this because it will lead to a lot of placebo. You want to make sure that it's as high as possible, and as you use it more and more you'll start moving it higher and higher and higher until you go into what I have now, a linear curve, and you're completely used to a square dead zone. So there's that setting. Now there's a couple more settings in here that could help you get a specific feel, not really transition from cross to square. The first setting is this one. So what this does, it basically just makes it so that you get quicker with your stick to the outer output. And this just makes it so that you can get maybe faster cancels. Now with Steam, what happens if you decrease this is it will actually decrease the amount of area you have to do side inputs, front inputs, back inputs. I don't know why this happens, but it just happens. So I genuinely just recommend leaving this in default, and there's that, or even just increasing it. But if you increase it too much, then you will even get rid of that output and won't even be able to cancel. So just leave it default or change it just a little bit. So now the other setting that we have is in the advanced options, and this one will get rid of the dead area on the center of your sticks. And this is actually, it sounds very good, but it's not as good because, as I'm saying, it could lead to a different feel on the center of the sticks. So I don't really recommend it as much, but you can do this. And as you increase this, you can have like a 0.40 dead zone on Rocket League and feel like it's a 0.05 dead zone. it's a choice. You can do it. It's there, but I don't recommend it. And now we're gonna go into DS4 settings. So now we're here on DS4. And here on DS4, you'll find pretty much the exact same settings apart from two others that I'm gonna show you and what they do. But we'll start with the most important one, as I said with Steam as well. It's the output curve. So this is the same as a stick response curve on Steam, and a relaxed curve would be the enhanced precision. You can also use a custom curve, which is the one I recommend. I don't know how it works here, but you can find it out very easily. Just type a value and it should work. That one is to actually transition from cross to square. So now you also find another setting here that's also on Steam and is the max output. And now you maybe want to change this one so it snaps onto that outer edge a little bit more easily. So you want to go to 30, so you barely move it, and so that's the same input as on Steam with the outer input. The third setting that you're going to change, and this one I actually do recommend changing, and that is the anti-dead zone. So the default here, I'm pretty sure it's something other than this, but I use 0.15 because it worked for me. The default, I don't know why, it just felt off. And you also have to decrease your dead zone to 0 here. So once you've changed those, I think you'll be just fine. But try not to change this one too much, but you can get rid of that dead center on your dead zone. Now there's a couple settings here that Steam doesn't have. So the first one would be the square stick. Once you've enabled it, you'll have this value here. The default is 15, but as you increase this value, what will happen here is you'll see, as I move my stick to the corners, you'll notice that at some point, the emulated input kind of snaps onto the corner. And so the more you increase this value, the easier it snaps to the corner. So you see how easily it snaps onto it, and the lower you go, the harder it is for that value, for that input to snap into the corner. So you can tweak this and it will change that. It will make square dead zone just feel a little bit different, but it doesn't change it that much, to be honest. So there's that. And then the second thing you can actually change on DS4 that's a little different from Steam is the sensitivity. And sensitivity, you might think it's the exact same as Rocket League, but it's really not it. So I can uncheck the square stick, increase my sensitivity. It will definitely increase the sensitivity, but as you move more and more your stick, it will reach the outer edge of your stick inputs. And what this means, it's basically just using square dead zone. So it's literally the exact same thing. It's emulating a square dead zone. So you're not actually increasing sensitivity. So I don't recommend using this. I recommend using this through Rocket League, leaving this unblanked, and then just pressing square stick. Square stick is already there, so you're guaranteed to reach those outer inputs with square stick. And that's really about it. There's no other settings you can change here that will change very much how you feel on your sticks. I don't recommend changing too many, but you can change them and it will give you a different feel on the sticks, and that's cool. And it's important that you remember that it's way better to actually learn the muscle memory of specific settings that don't change very much than to actually have settings stick to whatever muscle memory you have, because then you'll have a lot of placebo changing settings so that they can attach to your playstyle. You don't want that. And that was about it for this tutorial. I hope you can find your dead zone sensitivities. If you have any problems, let me know in the comments. I'll try to answer. And yeah, good luck with your freestyle journey.